Hannah Matthews clutched her 6-month-old daughter Emma tighter as she made her way down the narrow airplane aisle, her threadbare diaper bag threatening to split at the seams with each step. The evening flight from Chicago to San Francisco was packed with business travelers, and she could feel their judgmental stares as she approached her assigned seat in row 23. Her worn-out jeans and faded uniform shirt from the diner where she worked double shifts marked her as clearly out of place among their designer suits and expensive laptops. "Please, Emma, please be good for Mommy," she whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead. The infant stirred slightly but remained peaceful. Her tiny fingers curled around Hannah's necklace, a simple brass locket containing the only photo she had of Emma's father, who'd disappeared the moment Hannah told him she was pregnant. The memory of that day still stung. His cold eyes, the slam of the door, and the deafening silence that followed. She'd spent 6 months saving every spare penny from her waitressing tips to afford these tickets, often going to bed hungry to ensure she could put money aside. This flight represented everything she'd sacrificed for: a chance at a better life, a job at her aunt's restaurant that promised enough income to finally move them out of their cramped studio apartment. As she struggled to store her carry-on in the overhead compartment while balancing Emma, a deep voice beside her offered, "Let me help you with that." Hannah turned to find herself face to face with a tall, well-dressed man in his mid-30s, his kind green eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. Without waiting for her response, he easily lifted her bag and secured it above, the sleeves of his expensive suit jacket rising slightly to reveal a watch that probably cost more than she made in a year. "Thank you," Hannah managed, settling into the middle seat with Emma in her lap. The man took his window seat beside them, and Hannah couldn't help but notice his polished appearance, expertly tailored suit, the expensive watch she'd glimpsed, and a wedding ring that caught the cabin's fluorescent lighting. His presence made her acutely aware of the coffee stains on her sleeve and the hole in her sweater she hadn't had time to mend. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration as other passengers continued boarding. Emma remained surprisingly calm, fascinated by the safety card Hannah had given her to play with. It would have to do, since she couldn't afford to buy her daughter new toys this month. But as the engines roared to life and the plane began taxiing, Hannah's heart rate increased. Everything hinged on this flight going smoothly. The new job, the chance at a better life, the hope of finally providing Emma with the stability she deserved. That's when Emma's lower lip began to quiver. Hannah recognized the warning sign immediately and reached for the pacifier in her pocket. But she was too late. The first wail pierced the cabin just as the plane lifted off the ground, causing several passengers to turn in their seats with annoyed expressions. Hannah's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she tried to quiet her daughter. "I'm so sorry," Hannah whispered, bouncing Emma gently while fumbling through her bag for a bottle of formula she'd carefully rationed for the flight. The crying intensified, echoing through the cabin as the plane climbed higher. A businessman in front of them sighed loudly and put on his headphones, while a woman across the aisle shot Hannah a disapproving glare, muttering something about irresponsible mothers under her breath. Tears of embarrassment and frustration began to well in Hannah's eyes as she tried everything. The bottle, different positions, soft singing, but nothing seemed to soothe Emma's distress. The pressure in her ears must have been painful, and Hannah felt helpless, knowing there was little she could do to ease her daughter's discomfort. Each passing moment felt like an eternity, as more passengers turned to stare, their irritation palpable in the confined space. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her shoulders, reminding her of all the times she'd faced similar looks. At the grocery store when she had to put items back because her card was declined, at the clinic when she had to beg for a payment plan for Emma's vaccinations, at the diner when she brought Emma to work because she couldn't afford a babysitter. Being a single mother at 24 wasn't what she'd planned for her life, but she was trying her best, even if the rest of the world seemed determined to remind her that her best wasn't good enough. That's when the man beside her shifted in his seat. "May I?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible over Emma's cries. Before Hannah could respond, he began to whisper something, words she couldn't quite make out but delivered in a gentle, melodic tone that seemed to cut through Emma's wails like a warm breeze dispersing storm clouds. To Hannah's astonishment, Emma's crying began to subside. Within moments, her daughter was staring at the stranger with wide, curious eyes, her little chest still hitching with residual hiccups, but otherwise calm. The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that Hannah could hardly believe it was real. The cabin fell silent, the absence of Emma's cries leaving a stillness that felt almost magical. "How did you—" Hannah began, but the words caught in her throat as she noticed the pain that flashed across the man's features before he quickly masked it with a smile. It was gone in an instant, but she'd seen it, a glimpse of something raw and wounded behind his composed exterior. "Always works. My daughter used to cry the same way," he said quietly, his fingers absently turning the wedding ring on his left hand. "I'm James, by the way. James Morrison." "Hannah Matthews," she replied, still stunned by the sudden calm that had settled over her daughter. "And this is Emma." James's smile faltered slightly at the mention of her name, but he quickly recovered. "She's beautiful," he said, his eyes lingering on Emma's face with an expression Hannah couldn't quite read, something between tenderness and profound sadness. "How old?" "6 months," Hannah answered, watching as Emma reached out toward James with her tiny hands. Without thinking, she added, "Would you like to hold her?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, and for a moment Hannah thought she'd made a terrible mistake. But then he nodded, carefully accepting Emma into his arms, with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times before. As he cradled her daughter, Hannah noticed his wedding ring again, and the way his eyes seemed to hold stories he wasn't ready to tell. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James Morrison than met the eye. The way he held Emma, the shadow that crossed his face when he looked at her, the wedding ring that seemed to carry its own weight of untold stories, it all hinted at something deeper, something painful. What she didn't know was that this 5-hour flight would change both their lives forever, and that the man sitting beside her carried a story that would break her heart before putting it back together again. The next hour passed in a strange sort of peace. Emma had fallen asleep in James's arms, her tiny hand wrapped around his index finger. Hannah watched them, struck by how natural they looked together, even as she noticed the way James occasionally swallowed hard, as if fighting back emotion. "You're very good with her," Hannah said softly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. She glanced at her worn wristwatch, a thrift store find that kept decent enough time. "I usually can't get her to sleep without walking her for hours. I can take her back if your arm's getting tired." James shook his head slightly. "She's fine. My daughter—" He paused, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around Emma. "She would have been 4 this March. Her name was Lily." The past tense hit Hannah like a physical blow. "I'm so sorry," she breathed, understanding now the sadness she'd glimpsed in his eyes. "I shouldn't have—" "It's okay," James interrupted gently. "It was 3 years ago. A rainy night, a drunk driver, a red light he didn't see." His words were measured, careful, as if he'd rehearsed them many times. "I lost both Lily and my wife, Catherine, that night." Hannah felt tears pricking at her eyes. Here she was, worrying about making rent and stretching her last $20 until payday, while this man had lost something far more precious than money could ever buy. "That's terrible. I can't even imagine." "Neither could I until it happened," James said, looking down at Emma's peaceful face. "I was working late at the firm. I'm a corporate lawyer. Catherine was picking Lily up from her grandmother's house. They were only 10 minutes from home." He paused, his free hand unconsciously touching his wedding ring. "I keep thinking if I'd just left work on time that day, if I'd been the one to pick Lily up." "You can't think that way," Hannah said softly, placing her hand on his arm before quickly withdrawing it, suddenly conscious of the contrast between his fine wool suit and her threadbare sweater. "I know," he sighed. "My therapist says the same thing. But it's hard not to, especially on nights like this." He gestured slightly to Emma. "She reminds me so much of Lily at this age. The same curious eyes, the same way of grabbing fingers." A flight attendant passed by with a drink cart, breaking the moment. James carefully shifted Emma back to Hannah's arms and ordered a scotch. When he noticed Hannah declining anything, he asked, "Would you like something? Water, maybe?" Hannah shook her head, embarrassed to admit she couldn't even afford the $5 bottle of water. She'd packed an empty water bottle in her bag, planning to fill it at a drinking fountain during their layover. "I'm fine, thanks." James studied her face for a moment, then turned back to the flight attendant. "Could we get 2 waters, please? And maybe some extra pretzels?" Before Hannah could protest, the waters and snacks were on their tray tables. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I wanted to," he replied simply, then asked, What about Emma's father, if you don't mind me asking? Hannah's fingers went to her locket automatically. He's not in the picture, she said, the familiar bitterness creeping into her voice. Mark was, well, let's just say he wasn't ready to be a father. The moment I told him I was pregnant, he told me it was my problem to deal with. Haven't heard from him since. His loss, James said, with such quiet conviction that Hannah felt her throat tighten. Sometimes I think it's better this way, she continued, surprising herself with her candor. At least Emma won't have to deal with someone who doesn't want her. But then there are moments like tonight on the plane, when it all feels so overwhelming. You're doing an amazing job, James said, his green eyes meeting hers with unexpected intensity. I can see it in how Emma looks at you, how secure she feels. That's not easy to achieve as a single parent, especially with everything you're dealing with. Hannah felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. I'm trying, she admitted. That's why we're on this flight, actually. My aunt owns a restaurant in San Francisco and she's offered me a job. Better pay, regular hours. Maybe even health insurance for Emma eventually. I can't afford to mess this up. What does your aunt's restaurant serve? James asked, and Hannah noticed how he seemed genuinely interested, leaning slightly toward her as she spoke. Italian cuisine, my grandmother's recipes mostly. I practically grew up in that kitchen, learning to make pasta from scratch with my Aunt Maria. A small smile played at her lips. It's funny, when I got pregnant, everyone told me my life was over, but maybe it's just beginning differently than I planned. James nodded thoughtfully. Life has a way of surprising us, he said, and Hannah caught the double meaning in his words. Sometimes the hardest endings lead to unexpected beginnings. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing Emma to stir in Hannah's arms. Before she could fully wake, James began humming softly, the same melodic tune from earlier. Hannah recognized it now. Somewhere Over the Rainbow. It was Lily's favorite, James explained, catching her recognition. Catherine used to sing it every night before bed. After the accident, I couldn't listen to it for months, but now it's one of the few things that makes me feel close to them. Hannah watched as Emma settled back into sleep, soothed by James's humming. The overhead lights had dimmed for the night flight, and most passengers around them were dozing or watching movies on their tablets. In this quiet moment, she felt as if they were in their own small world, suspended between cities, between past and future. What she didn't yet realize was that James Morrison was feeling something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. And as Emma slept peacefully between them, neither of them knew that their chance meeting at 35,000 feet was about to become much more complicated than either could have imagined. Because in James's briefcase, carefully tucked away, was a letter that would change everything. A letter that connected him to Hannah in a way that would make their growing attraction both inevitable and impossible. 3 hours into the flight, Hannah excused herself to change Emma's diaper, carefully rationing her few remaining wipes. She couldn't afford to buy more until her next paycheck. When she returned, she found James alone with his thoughts, quickly tucking a letter back into his briefcase, his hands trembling slightly. As their corporate law firm's newest partner, he'd been assigned to handle the estate of a wealthy client who died in a motorcycle accident last month. A client whose legal name was Mark Peterson, the same Mark who'd abandoned Hannah and Emma, though she didn't know he'd died, let alone that he'd accumulated a fortune in tech investments while his daughter wore second-hand clothes and his ex struggled to buy formula. Hannah settled back into her seat, Emma now wide awake and babbling happily. She's usually so fussy with strangers, she said, smiling as Emma reached for James again. She adjusted her worn sweater self-consciously, aware of the contrast between her appearance and his polished exterior. I've never seen her take to someone so quickly. James forced a smile, guilt gnawing at his conscience. He was legally bound to confidentiality about Mark's death and the inheritance that rightfully belonged to Emma as his only heir. But watching Hannah struggle, knowing she was working multiple jobs while Emma's father had died, leaving millions in assets. "Hannah," he started, his voice tight, "there's something I need to—" The plane lurched suddenly, cutting off his words as severe turbulence hit. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, instructing all passengers to return to their seats immediately. Emma began to cry as the plane shuddered violently, and Hannah noticed with horror that her last bottle of formula had spilled during the turbulence. Hannah clutched her daughter close, her face pale with fear, both from the turbulence and the realization that she had no way to feed Emma if she got hungry again. Without thinking, James reached over and took her free hand. She gripped it tightly as the plane dropped and rose in the rough air, her knuckles white with tension. "It's okay," he assured her, even as his own heart raced. "Just a bit of rough air. Focus on me." He began humming Lily's song again, watching as both Hannah and Emma gradually relaxed to the familiar melody. He noticed Hannah trying to salvage what she could of the spilled formula with a few precious paper napkins. When the turbulence finally subsided, Hannah realized she was still holding James's hand and quickly let go, blushing. "Sorry," she mumbled. "I've never been a good flyer. And now with the formula—" "Don't worry about the formula," James said softly. "We can get more when we land." "We?" Hannah asked, then shook her head. "I mean, thank you, but I can't accept—" "Please," he said quietly, "let me help. Sometimes we all need someone to hold on to." Their eyes met in the dim cabin light, and for a moment neither spoke. James felt a connection he hadn't experienced since Catherine, and it terrified him. Hannah saw understanding in his green eyes that made her heart flutter, even as her pragmatic mind reminded her that men like him didn't end up with struggling single mothers. The moment broke when Emma made a grab for James's tie, giggling as she caught it. Hannah gently disentangled her daughter's fingers from the silk. "Emma, no," she chided gently, then looked at James apologetically. "Sorry, she's in that grabbing phase. I hope she didn't ruin your tie." "It's fine," he chuckled, loosening his tie slightly. "Lily once managed to get an entire bowl of spaghetti on one of my court ties. Catherine just laughed and said—" He stopped abruptly, the memory catching in his throat. Hannah touched his arm gently. "Tell me about them. About Catherine and Lily. Sometimes sharing memories helps keep them alive." James hesitated, then nodded slowly. For the next hour he told Hannah stories about his life before the accident. Lily's first steps, Catherine's terrible cooking but beautiful laugh, their Sunday morning traditions of pancakes and cartoons. Hannah listened, asking questions, laughing at the funny parts and offering silent support during the painful ones. In return, she shared her own stories, working through morning sickness at the diner, the kind regular who left her extra tips when she was pregnant, the moment she first held Emma. "I was terrified," she admitted. "The hospital bill alone was more than I made in 3 months, but the instant they placed her in my arms, I knew we'd figure it out together." As she spoke, James felt the weight of the letter in his briefcase grow heavier. He knew he should tell her about Mark, about the inheritance, about his role in it all, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he disrupt this moment with news that would change everything? The captain announced their initial descent into San Francisco. Hannah began gathering Emma's things, carefully folding the few clean burp cloths she had left. James helped her, their hands brushing occasionally in the shared space. Each touch sent a jolt through him, a feeling both wonderful and guilty. "Hannah," he tried again. "About Mark." "It's okay," she interrupted, misunderstanding. "That chapter of my life is closed. Emma and I are moving forward." She smiled at him, a smile full of hope and determination that made his heart ache. "We don't need him." What she didn't know was that Mark's chapter wasn't as closed as she thought. The letter in James's briefcase would force that chapter wide open again, potentially destroying the delicate connection forming between them. As the plane began its descent, James made a decision that would either be the biggest mistake of his career or the most important choice of his life. But first, he needed to understand something that had been nagging at him since they'd started talking. "You mentioned your aunt's restaurant. What's it called?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Bella Maria's," Hannah replied, adjusting her worn purse strap. "On Columbus Avenue." "Why?" James felt his heart stop. Bella Maria's was owned by the Peterson family trust, Mark's family. The job offer hadn't come from Hannah's aunt at all. It had come from Mark's estate, which James was executing, the same estate that would make Hannah and Emma millionaires overnight. The plane touched down on the runway, and James realized he was running out of time to tell her the truth. But as Emma reached for him one last time, her innocent smile matching her mother's hopeful one, he wondered if some truths were better left unspoken. Because sometimes, he realized, the hardest part of falling in love isn't the falling. It's knowing that the truth you carry could shatter everything just as it's beginning to heal. As passengers began to deplane, James felt the weight of his decision crushing him. He helped Hannah retrieve her worn bag from the overhead compartment, knowing he couldn't let her walk into Bella Maria's unprepared. The truth had to come out now, before she stepped into a restaurant that was never really her aunt's to offer. "Hannah, wait," he said, as she gathered Emma's things, carefully folding her last clean burp cloth. "There's something you need to know before you go." His voice was strained, and Hannah turned to face him, concern evident in her eyes. "What is it?" she asked, adjusting Emma on her hip. Her daughter was clutching the safety card, the only toy she'd had during the entire flight. James took a deep breath. "The job at Bella Maria's. It wasn't your aunt who arranged it." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew the letter. "Mark Peterson died last month in a motorcycle accident. As the executor of his estate, I've been handling his affairs, including the restaurant his family owns, Bella Maria's." Hannah's face went pale, her freckles standing out starkly against her suddenly ashen skin. "What?" she whispered, her legs suddenly unsteady. James quickly guided her back to their seats as other passengers filed past, many casting curious glances at the contrast between his expensive suit and her worn clothes. "Mark left behind a substantial estate," James continued, his words coming faster now. "And as Emma's biological father, he's left everything to her, with you as her legal guardian until she turns 18. The job offer, it came from the estate. Your Aunt Maria sold the restaurant to Mark's family years ago but stayed on as manager. She's retiring next month." Hannah stared at the letter in James's hands, her world tilting on its axis. "He's dead," she managed, her voice barely audible. "And he knew about us? About Emma?" "He hired private investigators to track you down 6 months ago," James explained gently. "According to his personal documents, he regretted abandoning you both. He was planning to make things right. But then the accident happened. That's why I'm here. I was flying out to meet with you tomorrow to discuss the inheritance." Emma stirred in Hannah's arms, oblivious to the revelations shaking her mother's world. She reached for James's tie again, and the simple gesture made his throat tight with emotion. "All this time," Hannah said, tears forming in her eyes, "I've been struggling to buy diapers, to keep our electricity on, to give her a decent life, and he was out there getting rich." Her voice cracked. "He could have helped us at any time, but he waited until he was dead." "I should have told you sooner," James admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But then Emma started crying and you shared your story, and I felt something I haven't felt since Catherine. I was afraid if I told you who I was, you'd think I had ulterior motives." The last few passengers were exiting the plane now. A flight attendant approached, politely informing them they needed to deplane. James helped Hannah up, supporting her elbow as they walked the aisle in silence, each step weighted with unspoken words and emotions too complex to name. In the terminal, Hannah finally spoke. "I don't know how to feel about any of this," she said honestly, clutching Emma closer. "About Mark, the inheritance, you—" She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Was anything real, or was this all just part of your job?" James stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "My job was to fly out here and inform you about the inheritance. My job wasn't to tell you about Lily and Catherine. It wasn't to hold your hand during turbulence or sing to Emma. That was all real, Hannah. More real than anything I've felt in 3 years." Emma reached for James again, and this time Hannah let him take her. The baby immediately settled against his shoulder, as if she'd found her rightful place. "I believe you," Hannah said softly, watching her daughter's easy trust in this man who'd entered their lives so unexpectedly. "But this is all so overwhelming. I need time to process everything." "I understand," James nodded, though his heart ached at the thought of walking away. "Take all the time you need. My card is with the estate paperwork. When you're ready to discuss the inheritance—" "No," Hannah interrupted, touching his arm. I need time to process the inheritance, Mark's death, all of that. But I don't want to lose whatever this is between us. Emma needs dinner soon, and I could use someone to talk to. Would you like to join us?" James felt warmth spread through his chest as Emma snuggled closer, her tiny hand finding its way to his tie again. "I'd like that very much," he smiled, shifting the baby gently. "I know a great Italian place on Columbus Avenue." Hannah laughed despite her tears, the sound echoing through the terminal like music. "I think I know it too," she said, wiping her eyes. "I hear they make pasta from scratch, just like my grandmother taught me." As they walked together toward baggage claim, James carrying Emma while Hannah rolled her weathered suitcase, neither could ignore the feeling that something profound had shifted in their lives. The past had collided with the present in unexpected ways, bringing pain and healing, endings and beginnings. "You know," James said as they waited for Hannah's bag, watching other travelers rush past with their own stories, their own destinations. Catherine used to say that love shows up in the most unexpected places. I never really understood what she meant until tonight. Hannah looked at him, at the way Emma had fallen asleep against his shoulder, at the warmth in his green eyes that had replaced the sadness she'd first seen on the plane. Sometimes the hardest endings lead to unexpected beginnings. She quoted his earlier words back to him, slipping her hand into his free one. Emma stirred between them, opening her eyes just enough to grab both their necklaces, Hannah's brass locket and James's wedding ring on its chain, holding them together as if she somehow knew she was connecting two healing hearts. And there in the bustling San Francisco airport, surrounded by strangers rushing to their own destinations, Hannah and James shared their first kiss. It was gentle and brief, full of promise and possibility, witnessed only by a sleeping baby who had, in her own way, helped two broken people find their way back to love at 35,000 feet. As they walked out into the San Francisco night, both knew that while their journey had been marked by loss and pain, their destination had always been each other. The inheritance would change Hannah and Emma's lives, but the real treasure they'd found wasn't in Mark's estate. It was in the healing power of love, in the chance to build a new family from broken pieces, in the mysterious way that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our deepest wounds.